Yes.
Hello, I'm Veronica Dahl, and I'm answering Bob's questions in general and in particular. In general, I'd contrast symbolic big data AI first of all, symbolic AI with big data AI, since students are exposed to the latter, but not the former, even from primary school. Then I'd choose what to start with according to the audience. For instance, a humanistic sciences audience would do best, I think, with grammars and language, because language is something they know. They get the knowledge for free. And grammars, they get that at school, but it's necessary. So there is no harm in running a grammar right away, even if taught declaratively, to impress the executability property upon students. And this should further motivate them to see that there are the two right away. And I get them to think about how to help redirect those AI efforts that stress imitative or dominating goals into the overall goal of complementing human intelligence to help people achieve shared prosperity equitably within planetary limits. We don't have in any of our sciences, actually, an umbrella goal like that. I think it's time we had one. Let's start with our discipline. This, of course, is all personal opinion and not an official position of the group. Everybody has their own opinion, but of course, I'm sharing mine here. Now, the group I'll answer specific question for is the target groups least addressed in the previous answers. The previous answers were brilliant, lovely. I really agree with many of the things, most of the things that were said, and we have a lot of ideas there. But where we have less ideas is about the young, none about children younger than 8, a bit more from 8 to 10. We have nothing for illiterate adults, for functionally illiterate adults. Very little for students of literature and cognitive sciences. So these are the groups I'm going to talk about when I address the specific questions. The first one, do you propose introducing whatever your brand is of logic programming purely declaratively? No. For non-computing sciences students, I think that, particularly if they're young, they do better if they focus on language and on action and learn programming almost as a side effect of that. For instance, they can start by creating knowledge bases directly through natural language. They can say, I live in Vancouver, my name is Veronica, blah, blah, and that can be automatically transformed into a knowledge base via a pre-implemented grammar that automatically translates their sentences into prolog clauses. They may look at the prolog clauses or not, that's the decision of the teacher and the stage they're at, but they can be taught how to consult the resulting knowledge bases. For instance, at first through natural language questions, then they could see the prolog form of that, etc., before they ever have to examine their syntax or take the trouble of directly programming a knowledge base in terms of clauses themselves. And I believe that the younger the student, the more operational their learning should be, because kids like action. So let them use what they know, language, and motivate them with action. They're naturally proficient at language, so they can use language to drive procedures that result in action. And these procedures are hidden at first. As needed or as appropriate, they can be uncovered and examined for further learning. For instance, they could generate a scene, perhaps using Paul's Datalog or Christian's art creating tools, and tie up with what teachers have to teach them anyway. For instance, teachers have to teach the imperative mode in English or whatever language you're using. Why not teach it using a little grammar with just 6 examples? Open the door, open the box, open the window, close the door, close the box, close the window. End of language. And these sentences could produce animations or drawings, again invisibly, and then they could examine how. Second question, do you propose teaching problem solving and reasoning as part of the course? Well, yes. I think it would be very hard to avoid teaching reasoning when using language-centered methods, since language proficiency requires reasoning. Problem solving would also, I think, come quite naturally. It occurs naturally in everyday life, which is where I believe we should start, solving problems of everyday life for the particular group. The problems of every group are different, but if we address their problems without tools, now we catch their attention. So we should start with problem solving in everyday life to have motivated students. However, depending on the audience, of course, these teachings can be subliminal, more explicit at the beginning, and then maybe more precise later. Would I focus on the symbolic syntax exclusively, or would I emphasize the natural language reading of logic programs? Well, personally, I won't even mention the symbolic syntax at first, except for grammars, the syntax of grammars. You write a grammar by saying left-hand side, little arrow, right-hand side, etc., so that they can read the grammars. And this is because it is quite likely that they already know grammars. Non-computing science students come from literature, for instance, or cognitive sciences, and they're mostly familiar with grammars. So we can use that fact and start there. Also, rather than emphasizing the natural language reading of logic programming, rather than giving them a clause and saying, now, how do you say this in natural language? I do it the other way around. I'd work with eliciting how a logic program emerges from natural language sentences. Let them program with language, and then find out how it translates into Prolog or whatever it is. And since the hidden parser already does that, it's a program that transforms natural language sentences into logic programs, having students test the parser until they get the idea would be a very natural way of promoting that learning. So basically, I focus on teaching through the language that they already know, natural language. Do you believe there's a need to teach formal semantics? Well, perhaps not for the kind of audience I'm now thinking we should probably be explicitly addressing, namely the illiterate, the functionally illiterate, the young. In any case, not at first. And then I had a final thought that it's that people can understand more natural sentences, more natural language sentences than they can produce. Sorry, I'm very sleepy. And linguists informed us that the interplay between competence and performance is crucial in language learning. They mutually feed on each other. Might there be an analogy with formal language learning? Might it be similar to learning natural languages in the sense that you have to interleave different aspects? Competence and performance in natural language maybe for us we have an interest in astutely interleaving our teachings of procedural and declarative views rather than favoring one over the other. And voila, this is my take. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Veronica.
Can I pick you up on the action and imperative language side of things? So philosophers of philosophical logic tend to tend to assert that there is no logic for of imperatives, and in terms of logic programming, I would also suggest that maybe we don't have a logic for imperatives even in a logic programming setting. So how do you relate your proposed actions and imperatives to logic programming?
The meaning representation of an imperative is retrieved by a grammar that analyzes a sentence in imperative form. And it's the same as a sentence that analyzes one part of a database. That describes, a sentence can describe a part of a database, and then there's a meaning representation for it, which is a fact or a rule. And an imperative also has a meaning representation for it in terms of a clause, which will then order some action to be performed, some drawing to be done, whatever it is, as a result of the imperative. But even if it's not as formalized as knowledge base knowledge, the imperative, the knowledge represented in imperatives, to me, is not very different either. We represent it as facts and rules, and then they get expressed as calls to some drawing primitive, some I don't know, some call to big data, picture generation, or whatever, or even an order done in natural language to somebody or some robot, I don't know. Whatever it is our application calls for. But I don't see the big fundamental difference between representations of affirmative sentences and representations of imperative sentences. Of course, empirically, they're different. They provoke and should provoke different actions. But in terms of saying one is okay and the other one is not, no, I don't think there's that difference. I don't know if this answers the question, Bob.
Well, what the philosophers say is that imperative sentences are not true or false. They can simply be satisfied or not satisfied, and they claim that this means there is no logic for imperatives.
But I think that's a more of a linguistic thing than a real thing, because you can always consider them as true with side effects.
So Bob, I would argue that.
Yeah,
No,
sure.
sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was saying that I would argue that perhaps we could use constraints to represent imperatives. In logic programming, that the next possible word must obey this constraint if you are dealing with an imperative. So I view imperatives as essentially constraints that are imposed on whatever.
Actually, that's it is a trick that's used. Do a different part of the formalism to underline that it's a different kind of beast than an affirmative sentence. And you can use constraints, you could use assumptions, you can use calls if you're in a grammar call, a call to a prolog procedure. Whatever you use can be of a different syntactic form to mark that there's a difference.
I think we're using
from using these things just because the philosophers think it's not totally 100% correct from their view.
I think we're using imperative in different senses, and Gopal suggested possible worlds, and I believe that imperatives can be given some kind of a logical meaning in a modal context, which
Right.
Gopal was suggesting. Whether you use constraints or other ways of describing possible worlds and relationships among possible worlds is I mean, I don't think, I mean, that you can do it in multiple ways. The other thing that struck me was when you said use an imperative like draw for Christian's example, and there, what that imperative, if we're looking in Christian's world, that imperative is to say, execute the program, right? Evaluate the program, because that's what gets, that's how the picture gets created, right? So I think that, so now you're using an imperative as a different way of talking about what's going on, you know, in this logical space, or in this prolog space, or logic programming space. Anyway.
I think that the proof is in the pudding. If we can do it and we can formalize it logically, great. But if we can do it and it's useful, let's do it. Bottom line.
I have a question about that. I think your focus on, or your emphasis on, illiteracy or functionally illiterate is very interesting and very important. However, then that raises the question: is if they're functionally illiterate, how are grammars going to motivate them? Because it seems to me that grammars, you sort of need to be able to to see a sentence in order to analyze a sentence grammatically. And so I'm sort of worried about, if they don't want to look at sentences, they can't think of what don't know what a sentence looks like, as it were. How is the grammatical thing going to help them?
It's a great question, and I think the crux is in motivation. We need to use applications that solve problems they have in everyday life. For instance, they have to fill a form. They'll have to learn, like children do, from the basics, or relearn what they once learned, what they once knew. So if you, for instance, say, well, what's your problem right now about reading? I need to fill this form and I don't know how to. Maybe a little grammar that leads them step by step on how to fill that form would be a good idea. Also, typing the letters over and over. A grammar could help them drill. If they don't know the difference between an adjective and a noun, for instance, they could drill with a grammar that has these adjectives listed and these nouns listed. And they could analyze the words that come to their fingers that they are able to type. And in turn, they start being able to type more words and more sentences and more comprehension. That has to be decided very with a lot of detail by people implementing these systems to help them. And they have to work with educators, because we need pedagogy and didactics to know how to organize the subjects and so on. And I want to bring something up that this suggests. We talked earlier about, instead of going for let's do a curriculum and how do we help to follow this curriculum, let's look at problems and their solutions, and then the curricula will follow. And that's all very well, but a bit contrary to all we know about pedagogy. We have curricula because educators have established over the years of experiences and theories and research that this is the appropriate order in which to teach this particular group of people. Well, in front of any particular group of people, I think we have to have some curriculum that is informed by the knowledge gathered by people in education. We cannot just invent that. So I think the idea of going through the inventing problems and solve, it's a good one, but it shouldn't be the only thing we do. I think it's more important, in order to reach illiterate people, for instance, to figure out what the curriculum has to be, and then develop the tools around the curriculum, then vice versa.
So Veronica, when you say functionally illiterate, you mean that they are so clearly they can speak and understand language, right? Verbally, but they cannot read and represent the thoughts.
There are people that learned how to read and write, but then because of misuse, lose it. and they go through life telling people, oh, I forgot my glasses. Could you read what it says here for me, please? And things like that. And I learned about that. I read about it in 1984, about the growing numbers of functionally illiterate people in the States. I read this article at a time I was visiting the States, and I kind of verified that it was true even with my university students.
Right, right. I mean, this was apparently I read that army manuals are written as comics or something, because there are many people who. So it's more to do with, I guess, reading.
Yeah, for instance,
being
they
actually able
refuse.
to read.
They don't read. My math students in discrete math I was teaching, I taught a particular math procedure, and I said, well, you have to first do this and then do that. And in the statement of the exam, I said, step 1, do this, step 2, do that. Everybody did step 2, which was more difficult, and not step 1. They didn't read it. They didn't read what was being asked. They went directly to solving.
I see.
Now, in their case, it might have been a bad habit. They probably did know how to read. But what I read since then, since those days, and it's been becoming worse and worse. Yesterday, I looked up illiteracy rates in Argentina, and it said that a very great proportion, I got it written down, I don't remember, of children in grade 3 did not know how to read.
So one could say that, one is that we're not able to understand that. I mean, they cannot recognize that text or read it well. The other is that they can read it, but they're unable to convert that into knowledge so that, they can.
There's
So
a theory that actually says that people rely more on fake news, and because they get the ideas not from the information they may read or whatever, but from the social context they're in. If all their friends are voting X, they'll vote X, etc. And they lose the cognitive critical thinking.
thinking ability, yeah.
But that's partly because they've lost the ability to read. And so they rely on social media, on the TV, on information that's simplified and pre-digested for them.
So it's interesting, that, neuroscientists think that language processing is done in a different part of the brain versus reasoning.
But the interesting thing too is that it's plastic. If that part of the brain gets damaged, I can be retrained to use another part of the brain to do that again. I was so surprised when this happened to a friend, the mother of a friend of mine when I was in university. She was damaged in the speech area of the brain. And training, she didn't recover that part of the brain, but she recovered the ability by other parts of the brain picking up. Wow.
Wow.
We're amazing. I mean, it's absolutely amazing what human beings can do.
Can I ask you a question, Vero? We
Yes.
said that language requires, well, you well know that language requires proficiency in reasoning, but we also have a very bad example now, technical evidence that you can have proficiency without reasoning. The LLMs, they can almost speak to you, but they don't understand what they are saying, basically.
Mhm.
So now we have
I
to.
wouldn't call that language. I would call it form. I would call it syntax. Language is more.
Pretty good, right? And we have to admit it. I mean, it's persuasive in some cases, even, but it's not really reasoning. So I think we have to face the fact that that tool is going to be in the hands of perhaps precisely the group we are talking about, an app on a mobile phone, for instance. And so we have to go about the idea that we have to persuade people to go deeper into reasoning, into language, to go to the level where they actually engage in reasoning.
Yes. I think from whatever corner you look at it, language is central and crucial.
That raises a thing I've been worrying about for a while, or thinking about, with using this logic as knowledge representation and using natural language. And I remember very clearly as a college student where somebody says, I'm going to represent the meaning of John loves Mary. And I said, my God, how can you represent the emotional feeling, the context, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of meaning around this idea of loves, right?
Absolutely.
And they say, I'm going to represent that meaning. And I think, oh my God, what are they going to do? And then they say, it's a set of ordered pairs. And I say, what? Love is a set of ordered pairs? Give me a break. Okay, anyway, I mean, I'm over.
Absolutely. You
I
were
really
completely
did have
right.
that feeling. I really did have that feeling. So anyway, I think so I don't want to say that we're representing the meaning of John loves Mary as the English sentence. That's not what I think we're really representing. We're representing a very abstracted, stripped down, all of the important part of love is gone, right? All we have left is this little trivial concept of, now I don't want, of course, I wouldn't like to explain all of that way, but I want the student, I think it's important that we're aware of that, and that students have, when they speak natural language, they have an idea of what things mean, because they use them. I know what love means, it means a huge amount of social context and everything. But that's not what we're representing in logic. And I think we have to be, anyway, I was disturbed when I was told that I was being given the meaning of love, because I said, no, you're not.
Totally right. You were totally right. And thank you for the reminder. We have to be precise with language. It's
Also
very
an
important.
opportunity to show the reduction on the semantics. I mean, we went from, I use the same example, sir, with Juliet and Romeo, with this history from Shakespeare. And of course, that context helped us to highlight the huge reduction of meaning that we are going through. But I mean, it's a good example to show the difference precisely.
And that I would say is the challenge in knowledge representation, because the moment you say, for example, you represent it as a relation, loves John, Mary, but then that's not enough. You need, you have more information about what that relation is. So for example, it may be that, well, they started loving each other, or John started loving Mary at some point, and there are all kinds of information, and that I think is the challenge in knowledge representation. How do you bring all that context? That it's
plus
not a
of
simple
course,
relation. There is a lot more knowledge that needs to be added if we want
I
to.
think we have to be honest in saying we represent it in a reduced way because it's useful and we cannot do better with machines.
Yeah, we call that abstraction, right?
When made that we're reducing the real meaning into what is manageable and useful to us. Once that's said, then we can honestly continue. But it has to be said. And I think it's also important, as I say in my paper that I'm going to share with you, to be very clear with our jargon. I was talking to Georg Gottlob, who in the conference at ICLP was attributing all kinds of humanoid characteristics to LLMs by saying, when it invented publications I didn't have, when I asked him what were the publications of Georg Gottlob, this is in parallel to, I don't know what psychological phenomenon observed in humans. That, I talked to him about that because I think we have to be so careful not to humanize, not to use humanizing vocabulary to refer to LLMs, because the minute we start doing that, which is what the companies of AI want us to do, because they want to pretend that it's really human-like intelligence and they're intelligent and so on, it's not even true. But the minute we go that way and we fall in the trap and we use expressions like hallucinate and all these expressions that apply to people but not to robots, we open the door for companies to obtain legal personhood for robots. And that would leave us a lot more helpless than we are now in front of machines. It has been done for companies, and they do it halfway because they give companies personhood for ends such as rights, human rights. They have people rights, these companies, but they don't have the same obligations as people. So it's done in order for companies to not live up to their responsibilities, to
Plus
be
companies can be,
responsible. And it's the same thing with LLMs. We're going to be told, oh, well, the LLM said it. I don't know why it said it, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's not my responsibility. It's the LLM's. And because the LLM is a person and has rights, we cannot sue them because they don't have responsibilities unlike persons, even though they're declared to be persons. So I think that's a very dangerous slope, and we have to be very aware of the jargon we use as scientists. We shouldn't fall in that trap.
Yeah, no, the interesting thing is that companies can be created and, destroyed at will, but they still have personhood, right? That's the interesting part.
Well, there are many interesting parts, and it's
Yes,
not
yeah. Right,
it's not-
right. And you're absolutely right. I think the lay people see, LLMs as, almost human-like,
Yes,
because,
because they've been presented
whereas
to them
we
like
can
that.
see the machinery behind, so we know it's just a, statistical machine. So I think our perception of, of the tool is very different. And it really depends on, which angle you approach it from.
Right. Yep, we have a lot of work in front of us.
Okay, so any more questions for Veronica? Or then I will stop recording.
When shall we meet again? And thank you.